Welcome. Settle in for a moment, and let us go back to a hot night in early July in the year 2010 on the eastern coast of China. The night is still, and the sky is cloudless. One of the country's busiest international airports is going about its evening the way it always does. Flights rising and falling in the dark. Nothing at all out of place. Tonight's story is the story of that one night, the 7th of July, 2010, when Hangzhou Xiaoshan International Airport closed its skies for nearly an hour because of something no one could identify. Something an official investigation would never fully explain. There is one detail worth staying for. Weeks after it happened, an official told a Chinese newspaper that the authorities already knew what the object had been, but that the time was not yet right to say so, because the matter touched on the military. The fuller answer, he promised, never came. So, find a comfortable place and let the day fall away behind you. If these quiet mysteries are the kind of company you like at the end of a long day, you might subscribe before we begin, so the stories still to come can find their way to you. And now gently back to that hot, still evening in eastern China, where it all began. The city of Hangzhou sits in eastern China, in the province of Zhejiang, not far from the wide sprawl of Shanghai. It is an old place, and a busy one, known for its lake, its tea, and its long history. But on the night this story begins, it was busy in the ordinary modern way, with much of that movement passing through a single airport on the edge of the city. That airport is Hangzhou Xiaoshan International in the district of Xiaoshan. It is one of the busier gateways in the country, a hub where flights from across China and beyond arrive and depart through most of the day and well into the night. On the evening of Wednesday, July 7th, 2010, it was doing what it always did. The air that night was warm. It was the deep middle of summer, and the sky over Zhejiang held clear and open. The kind of sky that makes a hot evening feel calm rather than heavy. There were no storms on the way, no weather to speak of at all, just a still, bright dark, settling over the eastern coast of China as the working day wound down. Inside the terminals, the rhythm went on the way it always did. Boarding calls, long queues at the gates, the slow shuffle of travelers with their bags, the announcements in 2 languages, the soft, constant roar of engines somewhere beyond the glass. Families waited. Business travelers checked their watches. The departure boards turned over their rows of cities, one flight at a time. Out on the apron, aircraft moved the way they move at any working airport after dark, taxiing under the lights, lining up, lifting away into the warm air, one after another, and coming down out of it just the same. Controllers watched their screens in the tower. Ground crews did their work below. There was nothing in any of it to mark this night as different from the 100 ordinary nights before it. Nothing in the forecast suggested otherwise. Nothing in the schedule. Nothing in the long routine of a place that runs the same way every evening hinted that the next hour would be anything but normal. Hangzhou Xiaoshan was a machine built for repetition, and on the 7th of July it was simply repeating, smoothly and without incident, the work it had done the day before, and would expect to do the day after. And yet, there was something else in the air over China that summer, though no one inside the airport had any reason to connect it to their evening. Across the country, in cities far from Zhejiang, people had begun to look up and report strange lights in the sky, shapes that hovered, glows that drifted, and would not resolve into anything familiar. It was a quiet pattern, scattered, and easy to dismiss, and it had not yet touched Hangzhou. That part of the story comes later. For now, the airport was only an airport. The travelers were only travelers, tired at the end of a long day, waiting for their flights to be called. The crews in the cockpits were running through the same checks they had run 1,000 times. The night was warm, the sky was clear, and for a little while longer, this was simply another ordinary evening on the eastern coast of China. That stillness was about to break, before the airport itself entered the story, before any official closed anything. The first signs came from the people of Hangzhou, looking up from the streets and the riverside with cameras in their hands. Earlier that same evening, before the tower made any decision, a man named Ma Shijun was out walking through Hangzhou with his wife. He was a resident of the city, taking the kind of unhurried stroll people take when the heat of the day has finally let go. He was not looking for anything. He was simply out in the dark with someone he loved, the way thousands of others in the city were that night. Then, by his account, something passed over him. He felt it before he understood it. A beam of light moved across the top of his head, quick and bright. He looked up, and there, crossing the sky above the city, was a streak of white light, moving fast. I felt a beam of light over my head, he later told the Xinhua news agency. Looking up, I saw a streak of bright white light flying across the sky. So I picked up the camera and took the photo. The photograph was taken at 8:26 p.m. It showed a bright shape against the darkening sky, and it would become one of the first images tied to the events of that night. But Ma Shijun himself was careful. He did not claim to know what he had seen. He only knew that he had seen something, and that he had managed to catch a piece of it before it was gone. His was not the only image. As the evening went on, other residents of Hangzhou shared photographs of their own, and together they painted a strange and uneven picture of the sky over the city that day. Earlier in the afternoon light, someone had captured an object that seemed to hover in place, bathed in a warm golden glow, trailing behind it something that looked like the tail of a comet. It was beautiful in the photographs. It was also impossible to identify. And then, less than an hour before the airport would close its airspace, residents reported yet another sighting. This time, the object gave off rays of light, red and white, as it moved through the sky. By now, the story was building on itself, image upon image, account upon account, each one feeding the sense that something unusual was happening over Hangzhou. Here, though, the story asks for some care. These photographs, taken by ordinary people across a long summer evening, may have nothing at all to do with the object that later shut the airport down. Several of them could simply show aircraft, their lights smeared by the camera, their shapes flattened by distance and motion. The golden glow with the comet tail, the red and white rays, the white streak. Ma Shijun caught at 26 minutes past 8. These may be 3 different things, or 4, or none of them connected to the real event. The timeline does not line them up cleanly. Some came hours before the closure, some minutes before. They were gathered together afterward by people trying to make sense of a night that had already slipped past. That is how these stories tend to grow. A handful of phone photographs shared and reshared can take on a life entirely their own once a story begins to move. The images become, in the public mind, pictures of a single, unidentified flying object, even when no one can prove they show the same thing, or anything at all. And once that happens, it becomes very hard to go back and separate the real sighting from the noise that gathered around it. The genuine and the mistaken end filed in the same folder, under the same headline, told as one story. So the photographs are part of this case, but they are not its foundation. They are the texture of a city looking up, the record of people who felt something worth raising a camera for. What they are not is proof. Ma Shijun understood this better than most. When he was asked later what he believed he had photographed, he did not reach for a dramatic answer. He simply admitted what he did not know, whether the object was a plane or whether it was Xiaoshan Airport's UFO. He said, "I don't have a clear answer." That honesty is worth holding on to because almost everything that follows is shaped by the gap it points to, the space between what people believed they saw and what could ever be confirmed. The residents had their images. The sky had given up only so much, and the hard part of the night, the part that no phone camera caught, was still to come. For that, the story has to leave the streets of Hangzhou and go inside the airport itself, up into the tower and the cockpits, where trained professionals were about to see something they could not explain away. High above the city, an aircraft was settling into its descent toward Xiaoshan. The crew were doing what crews do on the way down, working through their checks, watching their instruments, lining the plane up with the dark coastline and the lights of the runway somewhere ahead. It was routine. It was the most familiar part of the job. Then one of them saw it. Out in the night sky, where there should have been nothing but the traffic they already knew about, was an object that did not belong. It sat where no aircraft was scheduled to be. It behaved like nothing on their charts. The time was around 8:40 p.m., the plane still in the air, the ground drawing closer below. A sighting like that from a working crew on approach is not something professionals shrug off. These are people trained to read the sky for a living, to tell a star from a satellite, a landing light from a planet, an aircraft from a trick of the eye. They are not easily fooled, and they are not in the habit of raising alarms. So when they reported what they were seeing to the air traffic control department below, the report carried weight. It was not a guess. It was a trained crew on final approach, telling the tower that something was up there with them. The tower took it seriously, and by some accounts, the controllers were not hearing it for the first time. Reports had reportedly begun arriving a little earlier, just after 8 o'clock in the evening, from controllers watching the sky, and from civilians on the ground below. The exact first minute is told slightly differently, depending on where you read it. 8 o'clock in one account, closer to 8:30 in another. That kind of small disagreement is common in fast-moving events, when many people see something at once, and no one is keeping a careful clock. What the accounts agree on is the shape of it. Something was seen. It was reported more than once, by more than one kind of witness, and the people responsible for the safety of the airspace decided they could not ignore it. The man who later put words to that decision was Ruan Zhouchang, a spokesman for Hangzhou Xiaoshan International Airport. His account, when it came, was plain and almost procedural. There was no drama in it, no claim about what the object was or where it had come from. There was only the fact of it, and the rule that followed. There was an unknown object seen in the skies over the airport, he said. So according to our regulations, we had to close the airspace. That was the whole of it. An unknown object, a regulation, a closure. Said in the flat, careful language of a man whose job was to keep an airport running safely, not to chase mysteries. And so the airspace was shut. The numbers are exact, and they are worth holding on to, because they show how seriously this was treated. Aircraft movements at Hangzhou Xiaoshan were suspended from 8:45 p.m. until 9:41 p.m. That is a closure of roughly 1 hour, nearly to the minute. For the better part of that hour, one of the busier airports in China stopped moving. Nothing took off, nothing came down. The runway sat empty under its lights, and the sky above it, normally threaded with arrivals and departures, was held clear on purpose. Think about what it takes to make that call. Airports close for weather. They close for emergencies, for equipment failures, for security. Those are causes a controller can name and act on. But this closure had a different cause. And that is what makes it so strange. The sky over Hangzhou was shut not because of a storm, not because of a broken system, but because of something no one could identify. A point of light, a shape that did not fit. The decision was ordinary in its procedure and extraordinary in its reason. As for what the object actually looked like, the descriptions are thin, and honestly so. It was reported as a fleeting thing, dot-shaped, a fast-moving point of light in the dark, not a vast craft hanging over the terminals, not a glowing disk with windows and beams, just a small, quick, bright point that appeared where nothing should have been, and moved in a way that drew the attention of trained eyes. The crew saw it. The report stacked up. The tower acted. And then, for about an hour, the airport simply, as waited, silence on a runway built for noise. That hour did not pass quietly for everyone. While the airspace stayed closed, real flights, with real passengers, were caught in the easy decision, held on the ground or turned away in the air, and the people aboard them had no idea why. Down at the gates, the hour felt nothing like a normal delay. A working airport is a place of constant motion, of departure, boards turning, and engines spooling up, and the steady churn of people moving toward their flights. When all of that stops at once, the stillness is its own kind of signal. Travelers stood at the windows, looking out at aircraft that were not moving, at a stretch of runway holding no traffic at all. Inside the terminals, word began to travel the way word always does, in a crowd that has been told nothing. Quietly at first, then faster than any announcement could keep up with. The footprint of that hour can be measured, and the figures are precise. In all, 18 flights were affected by the closure. Of those, 12 were diverted, sent elsewhere, rather than allowed into the shut airspace. The remaining 6 were delayed, held in place until the sky over Hangzhou opened again. 18 flights, 12 turned away, 6 made to wait. Those are not the numbers of a rumor or a misunderstanding. They are the numbers of an event that reached out and rearranged the evening for thousands of people, for the planes already in the air, inbound and expecting to land. There was nowhere to go but somewhere else. They were diverted to other airports in the region, to Ningbo and to Wuxi, cities near enough to take them in. Passengers who had expected to step off in Hangzhou found themselves coming down in unfamiliar places, with onward plans suddenly in question. For the flight still on the ground at Xiaoshan, waiting to leave, the wait stretched long. Some outbound departures were held for as much as 3 to 4 hours before they finally got away. And through all of it, the people caught inside the delay were told very little. Passengers heard the word. Everyone dreads at an airport that their flight was delayed, with no clear reason attached to it. The staff at the gates had little more to offer, because they were waiting on the same answers as everyone else. Into that vacuum, the real story began to seep. passed traveler to traveler, phone to phone, an unidentified object. The airspace closed. A rumor, then a louder one, that a flying object no one could name had grounded an entire international airport. By the time most passengers understood what was happening, the cause had already become a story bigger than the delay itself. Then, almost as quietly as it had stopped, the airport came back to life. When the suspended hour had run its course, the order came down that operations could resume. The first aircraft began to move again. Engines woke. The departure boards started turning. Over their rows of cities once more, planes lifted away into the dark, and others came down out of it. And within a short while the runway was carrying traffic again, as if the gap had never opened. The delayed flights got their travelers away. The diverted ones sorted out their passengers in Ningbo and Wuxi. The ordinary machinery of the airport, interrupted, simply picked itself back up and carried on. But the question did not leave with the planes. It rose with them and went out into the night, unanswered. The airport could reopen its sky. It could not explain what had closed it. Operations resumed in about the time it takes to watch a film, and yet the thing that had stopped them remained exactly as unknown at the end of the hour as it had been at the start. That is the strange smallness of it. 1 hour set against a question that has now outlasted more than a decade. An airport can absorb a single lost hour without much trouble. It happens, in one form or another, all the time. What it cannot so easily absorb is the reason. Most delays close cleanly behind themselves once the weather clears, or the fault is fixed, the cause as plain as the delay. This one did not close. The hour ended and the planes flew, but the cause stayed open. Hanging over the case like the object itself was said to have hung over the airport. If the crew saw something, and the tower acted on it, and an entire airport was rearranged around it, then one obvious question follows. What did the instrument see? An object solid enough to shut down an international airport should leave some mark on the machines built to watch the sky. While the planes were finding their way back into the sky, a quieter and more deliberate kind of work was beginning on the ground. An event like this does not simply end when the runway reopens. It moves into the hands of the people whose job is to account for it, to ask what happened, and to try to write down an answer. At the top of that effort sat the Civil Aviation Administration of China, the national body that oversees the country's airspace and its airports. It is usually shortened to CAAC. In response to what had happened at Hangzhou, the administration activated an emergency response plan. That phrase can sound heavier than it is. It does not mean panic or crisis. It means that a set procedure clicked into place, the one reserved for serious and unusual events. The steps an aviation authority follows when something has interrupted the normal safe running of its skies. A closure caused by an unidentified object qualified. The machinery designed for the worst days was switched on for this one. Closer to the ground, the work of verification fell to a regional authority, the East China Regional Administration of Civil Aviation of China. This was the body responsible for the airspace over that part of the country, and it stepped into the task of working out, after the fact, exactly what had been up there. The crews had reported something. The tower had closed the sky. Now came the harder part, the attempt to turn a handful of urgent reports into a confirmed, documented fact. What was the object? Where had it been? How high? How fast? How large? The questions any serious investigation would ask. And it is here that the case meets the puzzle that sits at its very center. For all the visual reports, from the crew on descent, from controllers, from people on the ground, the investigation turned up no radar confirmation of the object. No clear radar image of the thing was ever released. The screens that watch the sky over Hangzhou, the instruments built precisely to catch what eyes might miss, did not hand over a clean record of it. The radar did not pin the object to a place. It did not fix it in the air and hold it there for the file. The sighting lived in human testimony. The instrument record stayed inconclusive. That gap is worth slowing down on, because it is what keeps this case open. An airport was closed by something that trained crews saw and reported, yet the machines could not confirm it. That is a deeply strange kind of event. It cannot be filed away as fully verified, because the instruments never backed it up, but it cannot be waved off as nothing either, because professionals acted on it seriously enough to halt an international hub for an hour. It sits in the narrow space between confirmed and dismissed, refusing to settle into either. The skeptical reading of that gap is simple and fair, and it deserves to be said plainly. If an object is solid and real enough to close an airport, the argument goes, it ought to show up on radar. That is what radar is for. So, when the screens stay blank, the most reasonable conclusion is that there was no solid object at all, that what the witnesses saw was a light, a reflection, a distant aircraft, something that fooled the eye, but had no substance to register on a scope. By this reading, the empty radar is not a mystery. It is the answer, and the answer is ordinary. But the empty screen does not settle everything. And here is what it leaves untouched. The people who raised the alarm were not casual observers caught up in a summer of rumors. They were a working flight crew on approach and the controllers responsible for their safety. Men and women whose entire profession is reading the night sky and not being fooled by it. Their report did not need a radar screen to back it up before it was treated as real. The airspace was closed on the strength of trained human judgment alone. Whatever the radar did or did not show, the decision to stop an airport was made by people the system trusts to make exactly that kind of call, and they made it. A screen that showed nothing, while practiced eyes showed something. That contradiction between what was seen and what could be proven was about to leave the airport entirely. Once the story reached the public, it stopped being a quiet aviation matter and became something far larger and far messier, carried around the world and tangled almost at once with footage that had nothing to do with Hangzhou at all. Once the runway was busy again, the story it left behind began to travel far faster than any aircraft. Within a day, it had moved from the airport into the Chinese press, and from the Chinese press it leapt outward to news outlets around the world. The pieces of it were irresistible. China, an airport, an unidentified object, an hour of grounded flights. Put those words in a headline, and the story almost carries itself. It crossed borders and languages in a matter of hours, far past the stretch of tarmac where it had actually happened. With the attention came the guessing, and the guessing ran wild. Online, people reached for every explanation the world had to offer. Some were sure it had been a secret American bomber slipping unseen through Chinese airspace. Others pointed to a Russian satellite, or to a missile of some kind, a piece of hardware from one of the world's militaries caught briefly in the sky. And of course there were those who said it had come from somewhere far stranger, that this was a craft from beyond the earth. Against them stood an equal and louder crowd, insisting that any talk of visitors was foolish, that grown people should use their heads, that there was always a plain answer, if only the dreamers would look for it. The whole spectrum of belief lit up at once, from the cautious to the cosmic, all of it arguing over an object that almost no one had clearly seen. In the middle of that clamor came a perfect example of how far the story had outrun the facts. A video began to circulate, shared eagerly and widely, said to show the very object that had closed Hangzhou Xiaoshan. Here, finally, seemed to be the thing itself, caught on film. The footage spread through social feeds and then into mainstream coverage, picked up and passed along, as if it were a window onto the event, proof you could watch with your own eyes. It was not. In time, the truth about the clip came out, and it was an embarrassing one for some of the outlets that had run it. Two major American news organizations, the television network Fox News and the newspaper the Los Angeles Times, removed the video from their coverage. The reason was simple. Experts who examined it concluded that it had not been filmed over Hangzhou at all. It had been shot somewhere else entirely, hundreds of miles away in Kazakhstan. A piece of footage from one country had been stitched onto an event in another, and for a while, a great many people had believed they were looking at the Hangzhou object when they were looking at nothing of the kind. That single mistake did real damage to the case, and it did it in a quiet, lasting way. Once a wrong clip attaches itself to a true event, it becomes very easy to throw the whole thing out together. The footage was fake, people could now say, so the story must be fake. But that conclusion does not follow. The video was misattributed. The airport closure was not. The grounded flights, the suspended hour, the official who spoke of an unknown object and a closed airspace, none of that depended on the Kazakhstan clip, and none of it went away when the clip was pulled. The real event and the false footage were two different things that had been tangled together, and untangling them after the fact was nearly impossible. This kind of contamination tends to cut both ways, and it is worth being fair about that. For believers, the dramatic video was exactly what they wanted. Vivid proof to wave at the doubters, and they were slow to give it up, even after it fell apart. For skeptics, the exposed fake was a gift, a clean way to dismiss the entire affair as hype and mistaken footage and nothing more. Both sides found something to use in the same false clip, and both sides ended up further from the actual question. The noise did not clarify the case, it buried it deeper. And that is the real cost of all the attention. Somewhere underneath the bombers and the satellites, the cosmic theories, and the borrowed video, there was a small and stubborn signal, an airport that had genuinely closed for an hour over something its crews could not name. But finding that clean signal inside so much static had become the hard part. The louder the world got about Hangzhou, the harder it was to hear what had actually happened there. In time, the official answers would begin to arrive, offered not by online crowds, but by the authorities themselves. The first of them pointed to something thoroughly down to earth, a problem China knew well, hidden in its own crowded skies. The first answer from the authorities did not come quickly. It arrived weeks after. The airport had reopened on August 5th, 2010, when one of China's major state newspapers, China Daily, reported a likely cause. The object that had closed Hangzhou Xiaoshan, the paper said, had most probably been an illegally flying private plane. In China, such a flight has a name. It is called a black flight. To understand why that explanation carried weight, you have to understand how China manages the air above it. The country's airspace is among the most tightly controlled in the world. A pilot does not simply decide to go up. Permission must be sought in advance, often well in advance, with flight plans filed and clearance granted by the authorities before a wheel leaves the ground. The sky is treated as guarded space, and most of what moves through it is accounted for, logged, and approved, but not all of it. As China grew wealthier, more private individuals could afford their own aircraft, and some of them grew impatient with the rules. The approval process was slow and heavy with paperwork, and a certain kind of owner decided the simplest thing was to skip it altogether. They flew without filing. They went up off the books, taking short hops through airspace they had no clearance to enter, trusting that they would not be caught. And these were the black flights, unauthorized aircraft moving through a system that expected to know about every plane in the sky. That same month, the problem drew wider attention. The American magazine Time examined the black flight phenomenon, describing how newly rich aircraft owners were cutting straight through the red tape, taking unapproved trips that left no trace, but in the official record. It was, by this account, a known and growing headache for the country's aviation system, a gap between a tightly ruled sky and the people quietly breaking those rules. One voice in the reporting put the case bluntly. An industry insider, who was not named, offered a sweeping version of the idea. Most UFO sightings over the Chinese mainland, the insider said, are actually unapproved black flights being made by private owners. In other words, the mystery was not a mystery at all. The strange lights people kept reporting were, more often than not, just rule breakers in the dark, flying where they should not have been. It is an explanation that makes a great deal of sense, and it deserves to be taken seriously because it fits the facts almost too well. Picture an unauthorized aircraft with no filed plan slipping into the airspace near Hangzhou that evening. To the controllers in the tower, it would appear exactly as the case describes. An object that did not belong present where nothing was scheduled. To the people on the ground, it would be a moving light in the night sky, unexplained because there was officially nothing there to explain. And afterward, if its owner had any sense, that pilot would keep very quiet about having broken the law, leaving the authorities with a sighting they could never confirm and a culprit who would never come forward. The blank radar, the unidentified shape, the closure, the silence that followed, all of it lines up with a single illegal plane that no one would ever admit to flying. For a clean ending, that should have been enough. A homegrown answer, unglamorous and entirely human, neatly accounting for a night that had been blown far out of proportion. And for some, it was enough. The case could close, except it did not stay closed. And the reason is the one thing the black flight answer could not absorb. Within weeks of this explanation, a second official account would surface for the very same night, and it would not agree with the first. It would point not at a wayward private pilot, but somewhere far more guarded. Two answers from credible sources for one event, and they could not both be true. An explanation that accounted for almost everything, except why it kept changing. That second answer is where the heart of the story lives. The moment the case turns from an aviation oddity into something quieter and harder to read. It is also where the question planted at the very beginning of this video finally comes back around. Before the story goes on, a quiet word. If you are still here, somewhere in the middle of the night and the telling, whether you are listening closely or letting the voice carry you toward sleep, it is good to have you along. If these cases keep you company the way they are meant to, you might think about liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Nothing loud, Only a small way to make sure the stories still to come can find their way to you. And if you have a thought of your own about what really closed that airport, you are welcome to leave it below. Now, back into the night, where an answer was about to be offered and then quietly taken away. Soon after the night itself, before the talk of black flights had even settled, another voice spoke, and what it said was stranger than any explanation that had come before it. An official, speaking to the newspaper China Daily, said that the authorities already knew what the object over Hangzhou had been. This is the answer that was promised at the very start of this story, and it is worth saying plainly what it was and what it was not. The official did not describe the object. He did not name it, or place it, or account for it. What he said, as the paper reported it, was that the time was not right to make the answer public because there was a military connection. The matter touched on the military, and so the explanation would have to wait. That was the whole of the statement, and the promised fuller account, the one that was supposed to come later when the time was right, never arrived. Sit with what that does. It is not a denial. The official did not say the event had been imagined, or that nothing had happened, or that there was no object. Just the opposite. He confirmed that an answer existed, that someone, somewhere, had worked out what the thing was. And then, in the same breath, he closed the door on it. The public was told, in effect, we know, and we are not going to say. An answer that is acknowledged and then withheld is a peculiar thing to leave a story with. It is heavier than a denial, and emptier than an explanation. And the silence that followed it, year after year, with no further word, has shaped this case more than any photograph or any radar gap ever could. A second strand only deepened it. Sometime later, a Hong Kong newspaper, the South China Morning Post, reported that the Xiaoshan shutdown had been caused by a military test conducted at an Air Force base near the city. And it is true that a military airfield does sit in the Hangzhou area, so the claim was not made out of thin air. A test of some kind, near a base near the airport, would explain a great deal. A closed sky, an object the authorities recognized, and a reason to keep quiet. Still, this should be held carefully. The nearby base is the most likely candidate, not a confirmed source, and the report named a cause without ever laying out the proof. Now place the two official lines next to each other, because this is where the case turns. On one side, China Daily, in early August, points to an illegal private aircraft, a rule breaker in the dark. On the other side, the South China Morning Post points to a military test at a nearby base. Both came from credible outlets. Both were offered within weeks of each other, about the same single night, and they cannot both be the full truth. A wayward civilian pilot is not a military exercise. The state was not speaking with one voice about what had happened over Hangzhou. It was speaking with two, and the two did not agree. It helps to remember the wider moment, though only as background. This was a period when China was doing serious and secretive work in its skies. In that same year, the country carried out a ground-based missile interception test, the kind of program a government guards closely. That is context, not a connection. There is no established link between any particular test and the 7th of July, but it sets the scene. In a year of guarded military activity, an official saying a closure touched on the military lands differently than it would in a quiet one. The skeptical reading of all this is calm and entirely reasonable, and it should be given its due. A state with secrets, the argument goes, has every reason to let a vague phrase do its work, hint at the military, offer no detail, promise a fuller answer that never comes, and a curious public will eventually drift away. By this reading, the military connection was not a clue to anything strange. It was the ordinary machinery of secrecy, a convenient way to quiet a story that had grown too loud, and it need not point to anything more exotic than a government that simply did not want to explain itself. That reading is strong, and yet it does not quite close the door because of the exact shape of what the official chose to say. He did not deny the event, which would have been the simplest way to make it disappear. He did not call it a mistake or a hoax or a trick of the light. He confirmed that there had been something, that an answer had been found, and that it was being held back for reasons tied to the military. A government trying only to bury an embarrassment usually reaches for denial. This was the opposite of denial. It was acknowledgement, followed by silence. And whatever lies behind that choice, it is a stranger thing to leave in the record than a flat no would have been. So the case did not resolve. It thickened. Two official answers that contradict each other, a confirmed object with a withheld explanation, and a single sentence about the military that has never been followed by another. For the people trying to understand Hangzhou, that was almost worse than no answer at all. And here's the thing that made the whole question harder still. The 7th of July was not the only night that summer when China looked up at something it could not name. Across the country, in the weeks before and after, other lights were appearing in other skies, and they form a pattern the airport closure cannot be fully understood without. To understand the 7th of July, it helps to stop looking only at Hangzhou and look instead at the whole country around it, because the airport closure did not fall out of an empty sky. It happened in the middle of a summer when people all across China were lifting their eyes and reporting things they could not name. Xiaoshan was the loudest of these events, the one that grounded flights and made headlines abroad. But it was far from alone. Go back 1 week to the far northwest. On the 30th of June in the city of Urumqi in Xinjiang, residents looked up and saw a shiny round object moving slowly across the sky. It drifted toward the east, unhurried, and behind it trailed a light as though something were following in its wake. It was the kind of sighting that, on its own, would have set a city talking. And Urumqi did talk. But Urumqi also got an answer, and the answer was earthly. Song Huagang, the Secretary General of the Xinjiang Astronomy Society, looked at the reports and offered a calm, grounded explanation. What the residents had seen, he concluded, was debris from a missile that had been launched by the American military, not a craft, not a visitor. The leftover trail of a human machine, catching the light as it crossed the sky. It was the sort of explanation that fits the evidence without asking anyone to believe in anything strange, and it stood in quiet contrast to the silence that would later surround Hangzhou. Then the lights moved on, as if working their way across the map. 8 days after the airport closed on the 15th of July, the city of Chongqing had its turn. There, witnesses reported not one object, but 4 lantern-like shapes arranged in the sky in the form of a diamond. The 4 lights hovered together over Shaping Park, a public space in the heart of the city, and they did not pass quickly. They held their position for more than an hour, long enough for a crowd to gather and watch and wonder before the night gave them up. By the time the summer wore on, the scattered reports had become a genuine pattern. China had logged at least 8 or 9 separate sightings since the start of June, spread far across the country. They came from Hunan and Sichuan, in the center and southwest, from Yunnan in the deep south, from Shanxi and Shandong and Niwu in the north, from Zhejiang, where Hangzhou sits, and from Xinjiang far out west. This was not a single odd night in a single city. It was a season of the unexplained, stretching across provinces that share little except the same wide summer sky. A cluster like that can be read in two directions, and honest people read it both ways. To those inclined to believe, it suggests that something real was genuinely moving through China's skies that summer, appearing again and again to too many people in too many places to be brushed aside. Why would the sightings cluster so tightly in time if there were nothing behind them? To those inclined to doubt, the same cluster suggests something quite different and very human. A public that has heard about one dramatic sighting becomes a public that starts looking up. Newly alert, primed by the headlines, people begin to notice the ordinary traffic of the sky, the planes and lanterns and bits of debris that were always there, and to report them as extraordinary. By this reading, the wave was real, but it was a wave of attention, not of visitors. Both readings have force, and the summer of 2010 does not clearly settle between them. What it does do is place Hangzhou in company. The airport closure was the brightest point in a constellation of strange reports, and seeing it that way changes how it feels. Neither a freak event standing utterly alone, nor obviously part of one connected phenomenon, but the centerpiece of a season the whole country spent looking upward. And the season was not finished. The most striking echo of the Xiaoshan night was still to come, weeks ahead, in another corner of China entirely, because Hangzhou would not be the only airport that summer to shut its sky over something no one could name. 2 months after the night at Xiaoshan, the same impossible thing happened again, far to the north. On the 11th of September, around 8 in the evening, an airport in the city of Baotou in Inner Mongolia found itself in the very situation Hangzhou had faced that July. Controllers and ground staff reported an unidentified craft over their airspace, brightly lit, and once again the sky was about to close around it. But Baotou was not simply a copy of the earlier night. In one crucial way, it went further, and that difference is what makes it matter so much to the story. At Hangzhou, the object had lived in human testimony, seen by eyes, but never confirmed by the machines. At Baotou, the air traffic controllers said the radar caught it. Working at the Hohhot Air Traffic Management Bureau, which oversaw that airspace, they reported tracking the object on their screens, placing it about 40 kilometers east of the city. Ground staff, meanwhile, said they could see a brightly lit craft with their own eyes. So, here were both halves of a sighting that Hangzhou had lacked, the instrument reading and the visual lining up together. The thing the earlier case could never produce, a radar trace, was exactly what Baotou claimed to have. What followed will sound familiar, because the shape of it matched the July night closely. 3 flights, inbound from Shanghai and Beijing, were made to circle rather than land, kept in holding patterns while the situation was sorted out. 2 more flights were diverted away entirely, and the airport was closed for about an hour before the sky was handed back to normal traffic. A northern airport, a summer evening, an unidentified light, a closure of roughly an hour. The pattern from Zhejiang had repeated itself, almost beat for beat, in a province more than 1,000 miles away. Then came a detail that lifts Baotou above a mere repeat and darkens it. The event was described as a near collision. The object, by these accounts, came close enough to a commercial passenger flight that the encounter was framed not as a careful precaution, but as a brush with real danger. That changes the weight of the thing entirely. A closure to be safe is one matter. A craft passing near enough to a plane full of people to count as a near miss is another. If that description is accurate, then whatever was in the sky over Baotou was not a distant curiosity. It was close, and it was a hazard. And here is where the two cases split, and where Baotou becomes genuinely strange. The government later denied that the September incident had happened at all, not denied that it was a UFO, not offered a competing explanation, but denied the event itself, where Hangzhou had been acknowledged and then half explained, with talk of black flights and a military connection. Baotou was simply erased. One closure was admitted into the record and argued over. The other was waved out of existence, as if the holding patterns and the diversions and the near miss had never occurred. Set those two responses side by side, and the inconsistency is hard to ignore. Two nearly identical events, one summer apart, handled in opposite ways by the same authorities. The first was confirmed by an airport spokesman and investigated by aviation bodies. The second was denied flat. You can imagine reasons for the difference: military sensitivity, embarrassment, the simple wish to make an awkward story disappear. But whatever the reason, the effect on public trust is the same. When the official account of one event is full, and the official account of a twin event is a denial, people stop knowing which version of reality they are being handed. The denial does not settle Baotou, it unsettles Hangzhou too, because it shows how readily an inconvenient night can be made to vanish. A sky shut twice in one summer, and only once admitted. By now, the case has gathered everything it is going to gather: the photographs, the closures, the contradictions, the wave of sightings, the second airport, and its erasure. It is time to turn the whole thing over and give the doubters their due, to lay out, as strongly as it can be put, the argument that every piece of this has an ordinary cause. It is only fair, having followed this case through its mysteries and its contradictions, to stop and give the doubters the floor. Not a token paragraph, but the real argument, put as strongly as it can be put. And the strongest version of the skeptical case is straightforward. Everything about the Hangzhou night, it says, has an ordinary cause, and the only reason the story endures is that people would rather have a mystery than a mundane truth. The clearest voice for that view came from Zhu Jing, a curator at the Beijing Planetarium. Looking at the images that had spread from that evening, his assessment was calm and unimpressed. What the pictures showed, he said, looked like an aircraft displaying its strobe lamps, the bright flashing lights every plane carries to make itself visible in the dark. No craft from beyond, no unexplained machine, just an ordinary airplane, its lights smeared and brightened by distance and by the cameras that caught them. It was the steady judgment of a man who studies the sky for a living, landing firmly on the side of the everyday. He was not alone in it. Experts at the planetarium reached the same conclusion, that the object had been an aircraft, and the meteorological authorities in Hangzhou offered a closely related read, suggesting that what residents had seen was most likely light reflecting off a passing plane, a trick of angle and shine rather than a thing in itself. Between them, these were the people whose business is the sky and the weather within it, and they pointed with one accord at the most familiar object imaginable. For the earliest sightings, there was an even simpler candidate, one that has fueled honest observers for as long as people have looked up. Some suggested that what the crews or residents had glimpsed was Venus, the planet, hanging bright and low on the horizon. Venus is the most misidentified object in the night sky. It is startlingly brilliant. It sits where you do not expect a star to be, and to a tired eye, it can seem to move, to pulse, to follow. Generations of sincere UFO reports have dissolved, on closer finding, into nothing more than that one bright planet. There was no reason Hangzhou should be immune. The photographs got their own deflating explanation, and from a serious source. Wang Sichao, a planetary astronomer with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, had examined a number of Chinese UFO photographs from around that period, and found a humble cause behind some of them. They were reflections, lamps, and outdoor lights bouncing off the glass of a camera lens, producing glowing shapes that looked to an excited viewer like craft in the sky. It is worth being precise here. Wang Xichao was speaking about Chinese UFO photographs broadly, not delivering a verdict on the airport object itself, but his finding cut at the very foundation of cases like this one, by showing how easily a convincing image of nothing at all can be made by ordinary light and ordinary glass. And then there was the rest of that summer to account for. The whole season of lights across the country. The conventional case had answers ready for those too. The lantern-like shapes hovering over a city park could be just that. Sky lanterns. The paper lanterns lit and released in their thousands across China, drifting and glowing exactly as the reports described. Balloons could explain others. And behind all of it sat the broader point the skeptics kept returning to, that a country which has started watching for strange lights will reliably begin to find them, reporting the planes and lanterns and planets that crossed its skies every night, unnoticed before. Laid out together, it is a powerful case, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. A strobe-lit aircraft for the object, reflected light for the photographs, Venus for the early glimpse, lanterns and balloons for the wider wave, a primed and watchful public to multiply it all. Piece by piece, the conventional explanations reach almost every corner of the story, and any fair account of Hangzhou has to grant that they explain a great deal. Almost every corner, but not quite all of it. There are details these tidy answers do not reach, facts that sit just outside their grasp and refuse to be tucked away. Lay the explanations out on the table together, the way an investigator might, and look at them honestly. An illegal private plane, a black flight, slipping through guarded airspace, a military test at a base near the city, a strobe-lit aircraft mistaken for something more, the planet Venus, low and bright, fooling a tired eye. Each of these answers is reasonable. Each one covers part of the night. The quiet question that closes this case is which part, and what each of them leaves untouched when its work is done. There were people at the time who looked at all of it and were not satisfied. A civilian investigation team made up of UFO researchers from Beijing and Shanghai examined the Hangzhou event and reached a careful, limited conclusion. They did not claim to know what the object was. They did not say it came from another world. What they said was narrower and harder to dismiss. That whatever had been over the airport that night, it was at least not an ordinary aircraft. They had looked at the ordinary airplane answer, the one the planetarium and the weather authorities favored, and they did not think it held. Their doubt rests on a handful of stubborn facts, and it is worth naming them plainly. The first is the contradiction at the official level. Two credible, state-linked outlets gave two incompatible accounts of the same event within weeks of each other. one pointing at a rogue civilian pilot, the other at the military. The strobe-lit aircraft explanation, however sensible, has to step around the fact that the authorities themselves never settled on it, or on anything else, and could not even agree with one another. The second is the instrument record, or the absence of one. An object judged real enough to close an international airport for the better part of an hour, left behind no clear radar image that was ever made public. That gap does not prove the object was extraordinary, but it does mean the simplest skeptical reading, that this was plainly a normal plane, has to explain why the normal plane was treated as an unknown serious enough to halt the airspace, and why the record of it stayed so thin. And the third is the strangest of all, sitting quietly underneath the rest. After multiple departments looked into the matter, no single definitive conclusion was ever announced to the public. The investigation simply trailed off into silence, and the one official who came closest to an answer did not give a plain account at all. He reached instead for the words, a military connection, and a promise of more that never arrived. A genuinely ordinary event does not usually end that way. Ordinary events get ordinary closings. None of this, it must be said clearly, proves anything otherworldly. The civilian team did not claim it did, and neither should anyone telling the story now. The honest shape of the case is not a craft from the stars hidden behind a cover-up. It is something quieter and more frustrating. Each conventional explanation accounts for some of the evidence. Not one of them accounts for all of it. The black flight cannot explain the military line. The military test cannot explain the contradicting black flight report. The strobe-lit plane cannot explain the official silence. And none of them, separately or together, was ever confirmed and stamped onto the record as the answer. That is the precise reason the case has never closed. Not because the strange explanation is proven, but because every ordinary one is left holding only a piece. A night, explained in several ways and settled in none. What remains then is not an answer, but a residue. The part of the story that outlasts every attempt to file it away. And it is worth ending there, with what this single July night leaves behind, and with the longer history of silence it quietly belongs to. The years moved on, as years do, and the airport went back to being only an airport. The hour it lost on the 7th of July was swallowed up by the millions of ordinary hours that followed. The flights that came and went without trouble, the travelers who passed through, never knowing that the sky above them had once been closed over something no one could name. Hangzhou Xiaoshan settled back into its routine. The case settled, too, into the strange and lasting place it still holds, a closure that everyone agrees took place and that no one has ever fully explained. To understand why an open answer was never very likely, you have to look past this single night to the country it happened in. For decades, China discouraged ordinary people from studying such things on their own. The interest existed, as it does everywhere, but it was kept on a short leash. The state allowed a research center to form in Shanghai in 1979, an approved place for the subject to live, and over the years the official attitude shifted and softened in its own slow way. But the long habit was one of control, of deciding from above what could be looked into and what could be said. In a place with that history, a full and open accounting of a mysterious airport closure was never the most probable outcome. Silence was always closer to hand than disclosure. That is the older pattern the Hangzhou case quietly belongs to, a vague reference to a military connection. A promise that more would be said when the time was right, and then nothing. The time never quite arriving, the fuller account never quite coming. Seen on its own, that withheld answer feels like a riddle peculiar to this one night. Seen against the longer story, it looks like something far more familiar. The way a guarded system handles a question it would rather not answer in public. The silence around Xiaoshan was not invented for Xiaoshan. It was waiting there already, part of how these things had long been managed. And yet, underneath the official quiet, there were people, and they are the part of this story most worth holding on to. A flight crew who saw something on their descent and did the responsible thing and reported it, knowing how it might sound. The residents of Hangzhou who looked up from their evening and raised their cameras at a sky that seemed briefly to be doing something it should not. An airport spokesman who closed an international airspace strictly by the book, because the rules said an unknown object meant a closed sky, and then spoke plainly about having done so. None of these people were chasing a mystery. They were ordinary professionals and ordinary citizens, each acting on something that was entirely real to them in the moment they faced it. The case may be unresolved, but their part in it was sincere. So the plain fact can be stated without drama, and it is the fact the whole story comes down to. To this day, there is no confirmed account of what closed Hangzhou Xiaoshan International Airport on the 7th of July, 2010. The explanations were offered, and they conflicted. The investigations were carried out, and they trailed away. The one answer that was said to exist was never shared. The closure is real, recorded, and unexplained, all at once. What it leaves behind is not fear. There was no terror that night. No one harmed, no horror to carry into the dark. What it leaves is something quieter and harder to set down. An open question, sitting where an answer should be, and, threaded all through it, the memory of a single sentence, that the matter was understood but could not yet be told because of a connection to the military. A door opened just far enough to show that something was behind it, and then closed again, gently for good. The answer was promised. It simply never came. And so we leave it where the night itself was left, not with a discovery, but with a quiet. An airport that stopped for an hour, a sky that emptied and filled again, and a question no one ever managed to close behind it. That is what this story hands you to keep. Not an answer, a stillness, the picture of a runway gone silent under a clear summer sky, and the odd, calm pull of a mystery that asks nothing of you at all, except that you wonder at it for a moment. If you are drifting off now, let it drift with you, gently, down into sleep. And if you are still wide awake, turning it over in the dark, that is all right too. Some questions are not meant to be solved tonight. They are meant to be carried a little way, and then set down. Carry this one as far as you like.